So this Chalcolithic is 8,000 to 6,200 BP. We're going to talk primarily about the Halafian, which ends at about 7,400 BP. Now Chalcolithic literally translate to copper stone, so that should give you an indication of some new kinds of resources that the people are using. The Halafian period is named after the type site of Tel Halaf in Syria. And this has a continuous occupation from the ceramic Neolithic to the end of the Chalcolithic. This particular Halaf culture covered most of the Fertile Crescent. The sites indicate that people are moving into the area for the first time, so we don't see necessarily previous occupations at all Halafian sites. Some of the things that we do see at sites are irrigation, and we see draft animals. So what this indicates to us too is that we might be seeing a dietary shift, so increasing dairy into the diet. This might also help to account for increasing population because now we have milk to feed children and don't have to rely just on breast milk. Now some of the characteristics of the Halafian culture is very high quality painted pottery, so you can see an example of that in this bottom graphic. Female figurines, sealings, which are stone stamp seals. We see obsidian objects, and generally the Halafian sites are small villages of 20 to about 150 people. This is interesting also because we see specialized production areas emerge. So we have places that are just making pottery, and we have places that are just working up obsidian. So again, some indication that there's quite a bit of contact between the Halafian communities. But we still don't see a lot of evidence of social ranking. What is interesting, though, is that we're starting to see some of the first archaeological evidence of ownership. So those seals that I talked about, the stone stamp seals, they're actually using those to seal baskets and pots. So put some clay on there, put the stamp in, and if the stamp then is broken, you know somebody's got into it. But obviously you're going to use the stamp in the first place because you don't want other people to get into it. So, evidence of ownership. The burial population from this time shows a high incidence of malaria. Unfortunately, we can't tell a whole lot about religious beliefs. I mean, we have these women figurines, which many people interpret as being some kind of female deity, but we don't know for sure. We just don't necessarily see the shrines like we did in Çatalhöyük. And there's no real evidence of warfare, but we do see some like clay missiles that could have been used in slings. Now, around 7,900 years before present, things start to change in Mesopotamia. We see there are like 4 environmental areas of Mesopotamia. We have the highlands, which are going to be the Taurus Mountains here and the Zagros Mountains. Then we have the foothills and the upper plains. And we have the alluvial plains. And then, of course, we have the desert. About the same time that Çatalhöyük is flourishing, which is up here, we start to see communities emerge in this alluvial area, and these are farming villages. Agricultural subsistence in this area, not the easiest thing in the world, so people had to try to anticipate the annual flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates and all of their tributaries. They had to learn to irrigate and drain land. And they had to import ground stone to make agricultural tools. So a whole lot of labor going into subsistence in this particular area. So it's not the most hospitable of environments. You don't just have these floods in the floodplains, but the deltas were hot and arid. You have sand, swampy areas, and then you have dry mud flats. So difficult to say the least. So the big question here then is, why did the first state level societies emerge in this area? And that's a question that we're still trying to answer, and we went through some hypotheses in our previous lecture on the emergence of state level societies. But it is important to understand that this alluvial area became the center of civilization in the region, and it was that way for about 4,000 years. The first part of this period that we want to talk about is the Ubaid period, so 7,900 to 6.2 thousand years ago. And the type site is Tel Al Ubaid in southern Iraq. And we see irrigation agriculture happening here along the Euphrates. And again, this agricultural base is important, and it becomes kind of the foundation of all cultural development in the region. Now, one of the primary sites of this period is called Eridu, and it's where we see evidence of the temple culture emerge. So it's the earliest settlement on the alluvium, established around 7,900 years ago. We see mud brick buildings. For this particular temple, we actually see it start out as a single room, and over the years, they build it up into quite a large temple to the kind of last form, which is a tripartite temple. And this is dedicated to Enki, who is a water god. It's very similar to later temples in Sumer. We also find a possible altar in this with burnt offerings. We see a lot of fish offerings also. So what this does is it indicates changing complexity. So the leaders were able to cull labor for public purposes, even if it's on a small scale with that like single room temple that was at the very bottom of this building succession. Now the timing of the temple culture is kind of important. If the temple culture emerges before heavy occupation of this alluvial area, then we can kind of see it as a central redistribution institution, and people needed that just to make habitation of the area possible. So redistribution of goods through the temples, and that would help people get through tough times. If it's after heavy occupation, then we might see the temple culture emerge as an institution to control water. So with increasing dependency on canal irrigation, there might have been a need for some institution to promote cooperation among the farmers, simply to build, maintain, and allocate water. But it does appear that the temple elite become the power base for this particular area. They have control of economic resources, labor, land, redistribution of food, craftsmen, and long-distance trade. So, again, some big social changes occurring here. Now, by 6350 BP, the Ubaid culture is all over most of the alluvium, and all the settlements are on reliable water courses. Probably by the end of that period, we see the potter's wheel, because we do see an increasing sophistication and quality of pottery. We do see some exotic goods, but still not a whole lot of differentiation in status. That starts to occur during the Uruk period, where we see primary state formation, and this is from 6.2 to 5,000 years BP. So between that transition from the Ubaid to the Uruk, all of the major settlements are fortified. Textual information that comes later mentions conflicts between the large settlements like Ur and Uruk and Umma. So the Uruk period is actually named after a particular community. It's the world's first city. It grew quite rapidly. So at the end of the Ubaid, about 5,200 years ago, there were about 10,000 people at Uruk. And within 200 years, there's like 50,000 people. That's pretty large population growth, pretty rapid. There are two explanations for this that have been suggested. One is that immigration or forced relocation by the powers that be, which is kind of supported because we see evidence of widespread abandonment of rural settlements. So it's not that people were having lots more children. What we're starting to see is an increasing density of populations as other communities in the hinterlands become abandoned. So this is actually the site of Ur, with the Anu ziggurat. You can kind of see it in its archaeological state, and then a reconstruction there at the top. So the temple culture is still really important, but we are going to see a shift, and we're going to talk about that too.